Hello and welcome to Closer Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Bai, your host, and we're glad that you can join us. It's been called the scourge of the 21st century. It's been called a cancer on the body of Christ. It's a reality that most of us don't want to deal with. I know when I find myself in situations speaking about it, that people say, oh yeah, I heard about that, but that's not here, is it? That's not our children, is it? It's here, it's there, it's everywhere. It's a scourge of human trafficking. Today, 2018, it's estimated by the World Health Organization we have between 40 and 45 million human slaves worldwide. We have more slaves today in 2018 than we had in the entire 400 years of the African slave trade. We've heard our Holy Father speak about it many, many times, the scourge of human trafficking. And today we're very happy to welcome to Closer Walk the Pope's point man, if you will, his delegate to the United Nations, a permanent observer of the Vatican to the UN, Archbishop Bernardino Alza. Archbishop Alza, welcome.
Thank you.
Human trafficking. Oh, it's not here, is it? You know, Archbishop, I've got my own little corner of the world and I work with human trafficking.
Yeah.
You work with it worldwide. Explain to the people of God what we're dealing with.
We are dealing with a phenomenon that is submerged in one aspect. That's why many people are not aware of it. On the other hand, we are dealing with a phenomenon that is so violent, that is so inhuman, because it violates all the fundamental freedoms that the human person could have. There's the freedom of movement, where there's a freedom, it's a deprivation above all of human freedom. And that's why it's such a grave crime, not only in front of the law, but also in front of human dignity from the ethical, religious point of view.
Archbishop, I have been dealing primarily in my little area of the world with human sex trafficking. And that's what our shelter's about, juvenile victims. But human trafficking is much broader. You shared with me the other day some statistics about people, about men versus women versus children, the different forms of slavery. Tell us what we're talking about.
So we are talking about a phenomenon that is not isolated, but it's also a phenomenon whose rise and fall, we might say, if ever there is a fall, because it seems to be always just rising, just keeps on increasing. More and more people are victimized, especially in the actual context. Probably you have heard that around 265 million people now are crossing international borders.
That's phenomenal.
And that's excluding people who are internally displaced within their own countries, which are also estimated to be more than 50 million.
Refugee camps.
And then there are those, out of this 265 million people, around 65 million of them are identified or could be declared refugees. So we are talking about a mixed mass of people moving across frontiers. They're refugees, they're victims of violence, and many of these is a very good context for human trafficking. I mean, this has made that's why human trafficking is a phenomenon that has been also increasing, because there are just so many frontiers in the world, there are just so many places in the world which are in chaos, which are in conflict, which are violent. And people, when they need to flee a violent context, then they do everything, even put themselves in danger or even in the hands of human traffickers. So that's why human trafficking has not seen any decrease at all, in spite of all the initiatives, whether at the international level, whether at the local level. the number of people who are trafficked has just kept on increasing. And now there is the high estimate is around 45 million people being enslaved by human traffickers. That's huge.
Is women and children are particularly vulnerable in that trafficking trade?
Yeah, they are because, of course, the nature also, they are also the most vulnerable sectors of the population, women and girls and children. But the statistics of the United Nations recently have shown that there has been an increase. You know, in the report, in the United Nations report, in around 2008, around 80%, almost 80% of those trafficked were women. And they were trafficked primarily, let's say more than 8 out of 10 cases, they were trafficked primarily for sexual exploitation. That is, they're put into the streets for prostitution. And then forced labor. Now, 10 years after, you know, at that time, 2008, the statistics showed that only around 12% of people trafficked were men. And now this percentage of men being trafficked has increased to 28% in the 2016 report, in a question of 8 years.
Is that
There
labor
a
or
big shift.
sexual, or what
It's
are we
above
talking
all,
about?
9 out of 10 men who are trafficked for forced labor, sweatshops.
Mm-hmm.
People who are practically imprisoned, they work, their passports, their documents are confiscated, they work practically around the clock, and they are not paid. So that's why, you know, sometimes if we fight also the human trafficking, we have to look into this aspect of it. That we use products, we buy products which might be down in the chain, a supply chain, that they might have been produced by forced labor. Agriculture, the agricultural side of forced labor is the most lucrative now. It's the best, we might say, market for forced labor, the agricultural sector. Sometimes when you visit California, all this huge farming, they say we are not saying that all these people are trafficked. Many of them are called migrant workers. But there are indeed cases, because these have become vehicles also of human trafficking. And then for women, it has, you know, in 8 years, the shift of women from around 80%, now there is, according to the UN report in 2016, the next report will come out in December this year. So it's a biannual, it's a biennial report. And then the number of women who were trafficked, decreased to around 52% of the people who are trafficked. But there is the other, we might say, very worrying trend, is that the number of children in traffic has also increased very significantly.
Well, that's what I'm getting ready to say. 52% are women, 28% are men. The rest are children.
Yes,
is that correct?
It's the children around 24%.
And is that primarily sex trade? Is that sweatshops? What are we talking about?
It's primarily sexual exploitation for children. It's like for women and girls and children, they are trafficked for sexual exploitation, and still a very rather small percentage for harvesting of organs.
You know, one of the things that just makes me nauseated is, in working with law enforcement, found out the reality of sex tourism. You know, that they are actually travel agents that offer sex tourism packages. And in some areas of the world, you can go buy a 5-year-old child. From 5 to 8, you can do this. From 8 to 12, you can do that. After the age of 12, you can do whatever you want with a little child. And the thought of that is like, God, what's going on in our world? And I mean,
I've always thought that this kind of sex tourism has had a decline. But when you look at the statistics, it has not. It has just gone probably more underground. They are less open about that, but has continued. One of the recent examples of the tragedy of child trafficking, because trafficking in the technical term, I mean, its technical definition according to the Palermo Protocols, which is the convention for what we call international organized crime, and that particular protocol is about human trafficking. Now, it says that, you don't even have to move people out of their houses or out of where they are in order them to be considered victims of human trafficking. I mean, this is an example of a Filipina mother. You know, this was one of the of all these conferences that we sponsor, of all these speakers that we invite from all over the world, whether in the context of the United Nations or in the context of the church. There was this, one of the most tragic cases was a mother of 5-month-old infant girl. The mother of this 5-month-old infant girl, made films, videos of her child and sold them to pedophiles online. So this is a form of human trafficking that has been completely facilitated also by the facility online. So that's an example of human trafficking that we don't think that is human trafficking, but it is defined as human trafficking.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things we found in our own work is some of the most vulnerable are people whose first sexual experience was in the home by a family member.
Yeah.
And from that, oftentimes here in the U.S., a combination of drugs, a combination of sex, and then, solicitation with friends. Again, the pornographic images and everything like that. And what we found is when children have had those experiences, and it's either a parent or a boyfriend,
Yes.
girlfriend of a parent, and they decide to run away. I mean, that's like shooting ducks in a bathtub. These kids are so vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think that's also really one of the that could be really the most challenging part of fighting human trafficking from the point of view, because that's human trafficking. So that's of course that's abuse of minors, abuse of infants, because many of these things happen in the homes.
Yeah.
Could you imagine? How could law enforcement authorities how could they get to know them if in a home, it's inside a home, if there is nobody in the home who would denounce them? So it's a very challenging part, and that's why, as the Holy Father said, this phenomenon, this scourge of human trafficking, we need really to make public awareness campaigns everywhere, because he said, people think that, as you said, people think that it is not serious, that it is not a major concern, and people think that it's far away. It doesn't concern them. But it's in every community, as the Holy Father said, it's happening right under your nose. Well, that's why I say one of the things that really could do it is to make that awareness of people people who might be mowing their lawns are trafficked, people who might be harvesting their strawberries are trafficked, people who could have sold their clothing, their clothes are trafficked. So it certainly is a huge challenge to how would you. I mean, there is so much need not only of logistics, but how could you make sure, at least to try to make sure that down in the chain supply, there is no slave labor.
And there is an app for that.
Yeah.
I know I've got it on my phone.
No.
I can't recall it right now. But Archbishop, stay with us. We're going to be back in just a moment with Archbishop Bernardito Alza, talking about the scourge of the 21st century, the sale of the human person. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Father Jeff Baye from Closer Walk Catholic Communications. Thank you for being here today, and a special thanks for the support that you give us. First of all, your prayerful support we so desperately need, and also your financial support. We are donor-driven, and that is what keeps us on the air today. As you well know, the truth is in great demand and in very short supply, and mainstream media is not going to bring you the truth of the Gospels of our Lord Jesus Christ, because that's not socially acceptable and it's not politically correct. Certainly we all realize that when this life journey's over, we don't stand before the Supreme Court, we stand before the throne of God. Therefore, with great clarity and great charity, to pronounce the truth of the gospel is important. Your prayers, your financial support enables us to do that. So we thank you, and may God bring you closer in your walk with the Lord each day. God bless you. Hello and welcome back to Close Walk Catholic Communications. I'm Father Bai, your host, and we're very glad that you can join us. We're discussing something that personally makes me sick, and I hope it makes you sick as well. Sad part about it is it's here. We can't deny it. The scourge of the 21st century, as the Holy Fathers called it, the reality of human trafficking, is with us. And we're very honored today to welcome back Archbishop Bernardito Alza. Archbishop Alza is a permanent observer of the United Nations from the Holy See. And Archbishop Alza, you know it, you see it, you hear it, you get sick like the rest of us do. Archbishop, the vulnerability of peoples. You know, on the break we were talking that when they were allowed to let children come to this country, you know, and let them in, you know, not with their families, the pedophiles were lined up. An Irish priest friend of mine in the Philippines, when there was a tsunami and all these children were displaced, you know, the guy who shows up and says, I'll take care of you and I'll buy you a hamburger, that's how they get these children. You were talking about the migration of people, you know, be it from a war zone, economic migration, the vulnerability that happens with these people. Tell us about it.
It is really that vulnerability that, practically puts him in the hands of traffickers. And that is why the fight against human trafficking really couldn't stop on just stopping them at the border or, arresting traffickers and aiding the victims. That's almost like the end part of it. So it's really, if we really want to fight human trafficking, we have to go into the roots of it. What are these roots? As you said again, statistics now would show that one of the primary drivers, if not the primary driver of people uprooted from the places where they are, from their homes, from their countries, are violent conflicts. That is now the number one driver of why people are displaced. When people are threatened with their lives, then they leave. And when they are threatened and they are in a very dangerous situation, then they are willing to throw themselves even into the hands of traffickers.
Anything for a meal.
Anything for a meal, anything to save their lives. The other, even wider root cause of people moving and people being vulnerable, rendered vulnerable by the situation, is extreme poverty. Why would 265 million people move across borders? They are abandoning situations which they don't see any light at all, that they don't see. They want to improve their lives, even risking their own very lives in order to have a better future for their family, for their children, or for themselves. That's why these 265 million people moving across borders these are really the two primary causes. Violent conflicts. I mean, look at this, how many Syrians are not that they are internally displaced, half of the population, and around 7 million of those 23 million Syrians have crossed the international borders. They're in Jordan, they're in Turkey, they're in Europe, they're everywhere, in the United States too. So those people, if you have 7 million people moving across the border, how much vulnerability there is for human traffickers to exploit.
And how many die in the journey?
And how many die in the desert? How many die in the seas? I mean, as the Holy Father said, the Mediterranean has become a cemetery. So you remember that the first trip that the Holy Father took outside Rome was to Lampedusa. Yeah, that Italian island to the extreme south of Italy in the middle of the Mediterranean, where so many people die. So we don't even know exactly how many people have perished in the seas, in the deserts, in the mountains. I know I'm a Filipino. So many Filipinos even also try to put their hands in the hands of smugglers. Smugglers are technically different from traffickers, because smugglers, that implies that the smugglers are facilitating, let's say, a passage of somebody who has paid for it, who has taken the risk, and willingly we might say, collaborate with smugglers. While human trafficking, by definition, traffickers, the person being trafficked, are trafficked against their will. You know, there is a certain moment of human smuggling, which is even probably a bigger phenomenon than human trafficking, in which so many, I couldn't tell you exactly what percentage, but so many of cases of human smuggling really end up in human trafficking.
You know, you mentioned that in speaking with young victims from Nigeria and Rome, and the girls talk about the trip through the desert and seeing the skeletal remains in the desert of former people being trafficked. Mm-hmm. And then their traffickers wanting to abuse them along the way.
That is where trafficking really enters.
Well, exactly, and they'll do anything not to end up that skeletal remain out in the middle of the desert, and you just think, oh my God,
yeah,
how does someone have, excuse me, have to live through that, and what could have possibly brought them to that act of desperation?
Yes,
and it's there. I mean, it's absolutely everywhere, and Archbishop, when we, and I always speak of human trafficking as a symptom, not as a problem. There's a much greater problem with the denigration of the dignity and the sanctity of human life and everything that goes with that. And we say, okay, if we're going to stop human trafficking, we got to stop desperate people. And if we're going to stop desperate people, what's the end game here? You know what I'm saying? It's okay. So we interrupted these traffickers, and that's great. We rescued 20 young girls. That's great. Tomorrow there's going to be another 20, another 60, another 100, whatever. Talk to me about the vision of ending the chain, if you will.
Yeah, the vision is really the most comprehensive approach really to human trafficking is to fight the causes. You know, what are the factors that force people to be in the situation of such a vulnerable situation, which practically they throw themselves into the hands of traffickers. And traffickers know very well how to exploit people in very vulnerable situations. Look at extreme, very poor girls in rural areas who have not even been to school, or have been to school but they have no work. So he said, okay, I'll bring you to Europe. You know, there is, this is a very classic thing. You know, the biggest group of trafficked women and girls in Europe, in Italy above all, are Nigerians. And, you know, we have made a study on that. The Santa Marta groups made a study on that the majority of these girls come from the same place, state, because that's the Edo state. That means that there must be something that what could we do exactly to, why are these girls come from the same place? So most of the traffickers must be working in that area.
They come with the promise of being a nanny and an au pair, of,
and then okay, there's you have studied a little bit of computer. That becomes context where you said, there is this is a very concrete case. This Nigerian girl, she finished a little bit of computer studies, and this guy said, there is a computer store in Spain that needs a sales girl, that needs a technician. So why don't you come? And so that started the whole thing, and not even just starting the journey of that is that immediately she was abused, multiple, so that you would lose. So to make you lose your will to fight or to report is that you must be completely degraded, you must be completely dehumanized, you must be completely abused, so that you don't have the will to fight anymore or to report to the authorities. Sure. And that's one of the hardest things also for the law enforcement authorities to fight. How could they motivate the victims to collaborate with them? And that's why, you have heard probably of this initiative of the Santa Marta Group. That's why it's called Santa Marta Group, because it was born in the residence where the Pope lives. the residence of the Pope in the Vatican, Santa Marta residence. And its specific objective is to have that close collaboration between civil authorities, above all border authorities, law enforcement authorities, and Catholic institutions who could take care of the victims. You know, the problem with the victims is that they get that almost like a Stockholm syndrome. It's not that necessarily that they become sympathetic with their abusers, with their traffickers, but they are so afraid to collaborate with the law enforcement authorities because they already have lost their confidence. They have lost all their dignity. So, you know, this is very scientific, and has been proven all over again, that when the victims see the figure of a religious sister, for instance, I mean, their conception of self and also their sense of fear is completely changed. And that's why the Santa Marta group, they have this house in London called Tabitha House. It's Bakita House, Bakita House, and they have this Talita Kum network, etc., of religious sisters who really take care of the victims. It has been proven that the victims, you know, when the victims are taken up by a state institution, they don't see it as something, you know, they're still afraid, they're scared to open up, they're scared, and then their healing really takes a long time. When they see that they're taken care of by the sisters, that's the time that really it seems that their really evolution of getting back their dignity and confidence in themselves is very rapid. Is rapid. The healing takes place. Now, once they're healed, and even just, you know, it depends on the cases how deep the wounds are, how deep the loss of confidence is. You know, that even in a few weeks they would collaborate with the authorities and denounce their traffickers.
Yeah.
So it's not only taking care of the victims, but also making them, we might say, more collaborative. Yeah, more human. Yeah.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, the Bakita House, the Pope has declared Saint Josephine Bakita, who was a Sudanese slave, who became a nun and joined the Canisian Sisters. And February 8th every year is a World Day of Prayer to fight human trafficking. I know from my own experience that the religious sisters, they bring a quality and a gift to that healing presence of the girls that no other paid professional can bring to it. Archbishop, you give us a huge insight into what we deal with the world, why we oftentimes get very caught up in our own. But we thank you for being with us, and we thank you for joining us, and may each day bring you close in your walk with the Lord. God bless you.